I talk to a lot of men about the difference between being lonely and being alone. Alone is a circumstance. I'm alone tonight. My family's off doing something else, or maybe I'm a single person and it's night and I've gotten home and I'm there by myself. So that's when I am alone. But just because I'm alone doesn't mean that I'm lonely, because I'm able to have this sense of connection with other people. I'm aware that there are people who are with me and for me. And so maybe my circumstance is that I'm alone and yet I don't experience loneliness. For others, though, they experience loneliness even though they're surrounded by others because they just don't have that sense of connection.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you?
I'm doing well. I like it when I'm described as usual.
Usual.
Yeah, usual.
Yeah, I didn't say ordinary. I just said usual. And we're very pleased to have one of our favorite returning guests, direct from the staff of Faithful and True, our clinical director. He loves when I refer to him as staff. Jim Farm. Jim, how are you?
Yeah, good. Excited to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you with us. We coerced Jim to be with us again today because we have a subject that we've been eager to discuss, and that's the subject of loneliness.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've been talking about is just the significant role that loneliness has in someone's propensity towards an addiction, what they want the addiction to do. You know, we often talk about our fantasies or our addiction is an attempt to be rescued from something and to be rescued to something. And one of the big factors for a lot of people is they want to be rescued from their loneliness. And so we're going to take some time just talking about loneliness, what a person may be experiencing now, as well as the influence or the impact of past loneliness on how they experience life now.
Yeah. We were talking a little bit about lyrics before we got on, and it triggered my mind. Do you remember the old song by Elvis, Are You Lonesome Tonight?
Yeah.
Right.
My mom was this huge Elvis fan, so when I was a little kid, I'd watch Elvis. And I remember this one time, he was actually singing on TV, and he started this song, Are you lonesome
tonight?
And he actually answered the question. He goes, I was. And I'm sitting there going, he's got all these women screaming at him. He's in the midst of this huge crowd. And he's the guy at the time, But he says, I am and I was.
Right. And that kind of identifies the deceptiveness of loneliness, that many times we have this image of what loneliness looks like, and it is that person that is isolated or alone. But what we know is there are a lot of people who are surrounded by others most of their time and during the day, and yet they are lonely in the crowd. They are lonely even though they're in community. And so one of the things that we simply want to acknowledge is that for a lot of people, they carry this loneliness, and really just looking at their lives, no one would be aware of that. And that's interesting. I love how Elvis, it's tragic how he answered it, but that reality of I am and I was, that the loneliness of the past can easily be carried into the present. And sometimes we have this belief, well, if I could just find the right people, then I would no longer be lonely. But the reality is it's more about our capacity to engage and be in relationship when we have people in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's a good starting place. Is like, how do we define loneliness? And I think we're alluding to that.
Right.
It's really not so much about, am I around people or am I not around people, as it is because like we said, like Elvis said, is, we can be around tons of people, but do we feel known? Do we feel seen by those people?
Well, it's that idea of intimacy that I often talk about. This idea that intimacy is when I'm known, I'm safe, and I'm connected. And so when I'm known, I'm safe, I'm connected, then I'm not lonely. And I talk to a lot of men about the difference between being lonely and being alone. That alone is a circumstance. I'm alone tonight. My family's off doing something else, or maybe I'm a single person and it's night and I've gotten home and I'm there by myself. So that's when I am alone. But just because I'm alone doesn't mean that I'm lonely, because I'm able to have this sense of connection with other people. I'm aware that there are people who are with me and for me. And so maybe my circumstance is that I'm alone, and yet I don't experience loneliness. For others, though, they experience loneliness even though they're surrounded by others because they just don't have that sense of connection. And kind of a big factor, I think, in loneliness is this idea of shame that we talk so much about. So if I have these negative core beliefs, and one of mine is I'm not choosable, or I'm not includable, or I'm not lovable, my shame becomes the barrier to my ability to connect to other people. And that's why a lot of men who come to our workshop have spent a lot of their time feeling alone and being lonely because of the shame that has kept them from being able to connect to others.
Yeah, it's a huge point. I know. We always joke around in my small group, and we're going to do that on Friday because I'm going to ask the guys. Did Greg say the 20%, is it 10, or what's the percentage this month?
What's this month's percentage?
And that's exactly what you're talking about. Is if I'm holding back that 10% that's most embarrassing or shameful, I'm gonna feel lonely because I'm hiding a part of who I am or my experiences. And so,
well, and I think it's that idea of what we're not talking about the most is what defines us the most. And so it may be a simple secret that I carry. It may be in my perspective, a very small point of shame. And one of the things for us to acknowledge is that this idea of loneliness is not just a male or female issue, it is both. That there are a lot of women who may be surrounded by friends who have all their Facebook groups or are a part of communities, but they too feel very lonely because of whatever an old historic shame message may be for them. And so as we're talking today and we're talking about this idea of loneliness, we simply want to acknowledge you can be lonely, and that doesn't mean that you have an addiction. You may have come from a family system that didn't value connection or didn't know how to connect. And so you were growing up, even though, again, surrounded by people, you felt very alone. But another thing I think can be true is there are those who grew up in families where relationships really weren't valued. It really was every person for themselves. You just got to figure out life by yourself. And especially if you grew up in a family system where isolation was normative, it makes perfect sense that knowing how to connect and have relationship is going to be challenging.
Yeah. I think that's so true. I think, one of the reasons I want to talk about loneliness because it's so impactful to us emotionally, spiritually, and actually physically. And so talking a little bit about that today, I thought maybe I'd share a little bit of the research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Around that. Then we'll kind of get into some other things around that. But I was reading a Gallup research poll, and I think they said it was something like, I wrote it down, 17% of U.S. adults report loneliness on a daily basis, with people from the ages of 18 to 29 the highest prevalence.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think young
You're
people
in your
like
prime. What are you talking about?
Yeah, but they're reporting the highest level of that. The one out of the Barna research was kind of mind blowing to me. But I get it. They found that it's actually there's a higher prevalence and it's slightly higher for churchgoers than non-churchgoers.
Yeah, and on the surface we would think, people going to church would have this great sense of connection. But if we dig a little bit deeper, for a lot of people, their church is the last place they feel like they can be honest about what's going on. That there's this sense of judgment or there's going to be this negative reaction. And so they go to church, they participate in the communities that are there, they may be active participants, but again, there may be these parts of their lives that they have shame about, that they don't feel like they can talk about. And it could be something as simple as depression. Depending on what your family messages were about depression, depending on what the messages you've gotten from the church are, someone may be struggling with depression and not feel like they can talk about it at the church, which means this part of their life was never accepted or welcomed there. So they're going to experience that sense of disconnection or loneliness.
Yeah. And don't you think that in the church environment, there's this... people feel this need to try to come across as we have the perfect family life,
right.
So they're not going to share some of those struggles that are there in their daily life.
Yeah, that's exactly it, which is really unfortunate because what we know, if it's faithful and true, is that willingness to risk vulnerability invites vulnerability from others. And so you're able to develop that level of intimacy that we're all after.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that the invitation is scary. There are the churches, the communities out there that really do their best to create a safe space for people to be honest. And at the end of the day, somebody has to find the courage to show up and be honest in that place. We are aware that, men come through our workshop. We do everything we can to create a safe environment. And then there are those men that, even being in this space, they're just not ready or not able yet to be completely honest about what's going on. And so if you're one of those people that are holding on to parts of their story because of that shame, we don't want to intensify your shame about that. We get it. I know what it is to live in secrecy. I know what it is to be active in a church and to be on staff at a church and be hidden. And so we just want to validate that it does take courage. And the invitation is, when you do find that place that is safe, that you risk. One of the things I tell the men that come to the workshop is that we want this to be a place that is safe enough, that they can be vulnerable enough, that they can be transformed enough, that they're willing to try it again. You're never going to find that perfectly safe place that you have no questions about risking. But if you can be safe enough so that you're willing to be vulnerable enough, to be connected enough, that's the pathway out of your loneliness.
Yeah. I like that we're talking so much about it, because what you're describing is that willingness to be known, be vulnerable, and that's really kind of the answer to this loneliness piece. And the not doing that is brings a lot of consequences. I was doing some research on this. We talk about this in the groups. If we don't share things, if we keep things internal, significant things, what happens? Loneliness, some of the physical consequences of that is, when we're disconnected, our brains release huge amounts of cortisol, the stress hormone.
Right.
And that's why we see, with people that, have long-term loneliness, we have cardiovascular disease, stroke, we have all these physical consequences. Where these come from?
Right.
And really, it's kind of this cortisol. It's amazing how God created us, that when we're disconnected, it triggers the stress response.
Right.
Triggers the cortisol release.
Well, and it kind of affirms that reality that God created us to be in community and connected. The one thing about creation that was not good, it was not good for people to be alone. Yeah. And so I often talk about the fact that it's in our DNA. It is who God created us to be, is to be in intimate connection with other people. And, we all had a reaction to this idea that in this youngest group, that is where they're experiencing so much loneliness. And so we all have this sense that that's the group that we think is joining, that is participating, that is involved in things. And it re-emphasizes, just because you are a part of a group, just because you have an organization that you go to, or you have the friends that you hang out with, that doesn't guarantee that you won't be lonely. It's that other piece of risking. Now, the community creates the opportunity. You still have to be willing to be vulnerable in that space to create the type of connection that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think it's a good thing to think about in terms of, well, what is the purpose of feeling lonely?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, why'd God allow us to feel lonely? Why does that happen? And I've always kind of believed that our emotions signal to us that we need something.
Right.
And so but we develop these core beliefs. I'm lonely, so I must be alone. I must not have friends, or I must not be desirable.
Right.
Where that feeling is, rather than, using it to maybe reinforce old core beliefs, I can say, well, this is signaling for maybe, there's things that I'm wanting to be seen around or heard around, rather than going into old negative thoughts about what, this emotion I'm experiencing.
Right. In a lot of the cars today, there's so many devices that help us stay on track, whether it's the GPS or even the thing that lets us know we're drifting into another lane. And there's buzzers and beepers and that type of thing. And like you said, our emotions are trying to tell us something. So our loneliness is actually that beeper, that warning system, that early detection system that's letting us know we're not going in the right direction and we're moving towards isolation, not community. And I can't say this universally, but I can say that for the most part, the men that I work with and the men who come through our workshop, it is their natural drift towards isolation. And so I often say, if you're not intentionally moving towards community, you're pretty much guaranteed that you're drifting away from isolation or drifting towards isolation. And the more you don't do something, the greater the isolation is going to be. And it takes that effort to kind of swim upstream to start going in the right direction to get from isolation into community.
Yeah, yeah. I think, one of the things you brought up at the start of our podcast was, well, how does our early experiences impact that for us? So if we did grow up in families that tended to be more isolated, when we are alone, it can trigger that emotional memory of that. Where now the loneliness really becomes overwhelming because I don't have the capacity to access, memories of connection. My natural, mind is set to remember moments of disconnection.
Right. Well, and we're also influenced by old negative experiences, those times when we moved towards community, we wanted to be included, and then in some way we were rejected, or we had that experience where all the friends were hanging out and we weren't invited to participate. And so it can be direct rejection that really intensifies that fear of that vulnerability. And so we can have old core beliefs about people, about trust, about safety, that when we start considering moving towards community, those can kind of start speaking to us in a way that we don't move towards it, we move away from it. And I do think if we are lonely, it's important that we become curious about where this loneliness is coming from. What are the old stories that are influencing me? What are the old core beliefs? It can be very simple, but for a family, that one of their family rules was, we don't talk about what happens in the home. What happens in the home stays in the home. Nobody knows the family secrets. Well, what happens is you become aware that there are certain things that you don't talk about. So you're actually living in a family of isolation, and so you don't feel connected to the outside world, but more than likely you also don't feel connected to your family. And kind of like what you said, if I don't have a memory of what connection feels like, and I don't have positive experiences of connection, I don't have that invitation to try and risk and experience something new.
Yeah, yeah. I've had a few clients through the years that had that experience in childhood where, they're in the cafeteria and they're sitting at the table by themselves. And then they're, as adults, they get in these social situations and they shut down. And they're like, I don't understand it. I feel, I'm with these people, but I don't feel like I'm with these people.
Right.
I feel like I'm over here, just on the outskirts.
Right.
But it's helping them to understand what were you feeling, what were you experiencing in that cafeteria as a little boy.
Right. When talking to the guys who come through the workshop, we do talk about the wise man, the survivor man, and the little boy. And one of the distinctions I like to make is the wise man is self-aware. So he brings his self-awareness into relationships. And that self-awareness actually helps him to be more safe in community. And self-awareness is when I have the capacity to see myself through the lens of truth. I see myself as God sees me. And that really is my identity. That's how I see myself and how I bring myself into relationships. Well, self-consciousness is how the survivor man operates, and self-consciousness is an over-focus on how other people see me. And one of the things that's true is when we slip into self-consciousness, we're no longer in self-awareness, and self-consciousness actually becomes a limit to our ability to connect. If I'm overly focused on how I'm appearing and how I'm being received and is this acceptable or not acceptable, eventually my authentic self is completely absent from the experience. And if I'm not there authentically, there's not going to be a sense of connection. And so I thought of that as you were talking about the little boy or the little girl at the cafeteria or the middle school kid that's trying to find his place. I think this is a huge factor for kids who moved to new schools or new communities growing up, that awkward trying to find your place the first day of school. And I've heard so many stories of men and women that they begin to believe their performance or their accomplishments or their abilities is what made it possible for them to connect. So instead of it being an expression of their authentic self, they believe they have to perform. It's almost like performance is the price of admission. I have to figure out what other people want, or or I have to figure out what this group is about, and then I become that so I can fit in. But I at the end of the day, I still don't feel connected. I feel lonely.
Yeah. There's the Elvis story.
Yeah.
I've been waiting to break in, not to interrupt Greg, but that's Elvis's story.
Right.
Is the number one entertainer in the world at the time, that you're seeing him on TV, couldn't be more popular, and things like this. And when the lights are shining, he's doing his thing. And as soon as the spotlight goes off, he's lonely.
Right.
It's I gotta find the video. It's so fascinating. He's right on stage.
Yeah.
Well,
in the midst of this.
and it goes even deeper when you look into like the story of his life and things like that, and what evolved into drug use was loneliness,
Right.
and not being able to handle that, and here's somebody who is surrounded by thousands of adoring fans, and if they only knew
Right.
that behind the fancy jumpsuit and glitter and all of that was a very lonely person.
That's right.
Well, and the same principle is true for us. The stage may not be as big, the audience may not be as large, the spotlight may not be as bright, but we can all know what it is to perform, and that performance is not an authentic expression. It's this image that we're projecting, it's the persona that we want to create. And again, that's one of the things that limits us from connecting, is anytime I'm showing up, trying to meet other people's expectations, performing and not being authentic, I'm not going to have this sense of connection and community. I'm going to be left feeling lonely. Another distinction that we talked about is the difference between solitude and loneliness. And I think that is an important distinction to make.
Yeah, because we talk about that as being one of the green circle items.
Right.
Where we can connect with our spirituality. But the solitude piece of it is where I willingly, create some private individual space for myself, but I know and I understand the value of reconnecting. I have that desire and I have the ability to reconnect in community.
Right. From a spiritual perspective, what I would say is solitude is the wise person separating themselves from others for the purpose of connecting with God, so that then they can enter back into community. And in that solitude, I'm connected to myself, I'm connected to God, which strengthens my ability to connect to others. Whereas isolation is the survivor part of us who separates not just from God, but from others. And also I disconnect from myself. The great danger of isolation is I'm not connected to others, I'm not connected to God, and I'm not also connected to myself. And so there is a distinction there. It's not what are we doing, but again, what part of us that's doing it determines the impact that has on us.
Yeah, I mean, because solitude is, like I said, it's part of the green circle item. When we talk about a recovery plan, it's about part of our growth is, developing, creating some private space to connect with God.
Right.
Because, and we'll get into this. I want to have a little bit of time on our next podcast to talk about the spiritual component of this. But even if our support system is a pretty strong support system, we're going to find ourselves at some point being alone.
Right.
Because humans are finite people. They run out of time, space, and energy. And so if we're not rooted in that form of connectedness with God, we're really going to be isolated.
Right. And I also want to acknowledge at this point that various traditions have different attitudes towards the spiritual discipline of solitude. You may have grown up in a church tradition that never talked about solitude. And so, it's kind of maybe something you're being introduced to, or it's brand new to you. Others grew up in a tradition where they regularly talked about going on retreats and solitude. I think the idea is it is our ability to be present with ourselves and be present with God in that sacred space. And for most of us, it doesn't come naturally. Isolation comes naturally, but being present with ourselves and be present with God is a spiritual discipline that we have to learn. One other thing that I want to just kind of distinguish, because it does fit into this, is the difference between an extrovert and an introvert. One of the things that we could easily say is that introverts are lonely, extroverts always have community.
The extrovert here.
Yeah. And I do think it's important to understand extrovert, introvert isn't about being lonely or not lonely. There are a lot of extroverts out there that are part of a bunch of groups and participate in things, but yet feel very lonely. There are introverts who know how to take good care of themselves and set time aside just to kind of recharge their batteries, that feel very connected to their community. And so really the idea is the introvert is that person that being in community, being with others, just takes energy from them and they need time to replenish. The extrovert is the person that being with others actually brings them energy. And what's true is every introvert needs places of connection and community, and every extrovert needs spaces where they can be alone and recharge their batteries. But if you think, well, I'm an introvert, that's why I feel lonely, I just want you to understand it really is more about my ability to carry my community with me and carry my relationships with me, even if I'm not present with them or in contact with them in the moment.
Yeah. I think sometimes people who are extremely lonely or don't want to be known might use that
Right.
as kind of a reason why, I'm not in communities, I'm introverted.
Right.
But oftentimes it's more about I'm not wanting to be known because I have a lot of shame.
Right.
And it's interesting because there's a lot of people that we work with, I think both spouses and guys that are struggling with addiction, is they sometimes get surprised that maybe they're more extroverted than they thought they were,
Right. Once they get free of the shame.
Yeah. And it starts to change their whole thinking of who are they as a person.
Yeah.
And so it's,
one thing is we're going to have a second part of this, and we're going to talk about, for those of us that are in community, how do we really maximize that? How do we steward? Because what we know is attendance is not enough. Just because I show up, just because maybe I do my check-in, that's not going to be enough to really create that sense of community that moves me out of loneliness. One other space that we can talk about in the next podcast that I think is significant is for people who are lonely in their marriage. And we do hear that a lot, that for a variety of different reasons, maybe there never was a sense of great connection and intimacy, and that's one of the things a couple's working at. Or maybe there's been a history of pain, and one person is really afraid to risk and invest in the relationship. Or maybe what's true for some couples is they didn't grow up with a good model of what it means to be in a healthy, functioning, intimate marriage. And so they're trying to figure their way into that. But we also want to validate just the pain if you are in a marriage, and one of the words that you would use to describe yourself as lonely in your marriage, there is a lot of grief and pain that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited we're going to do that here shortly.
I think that's the gateway to wrapping this podcast up today, so that we can get at part 2 here, talking about loneliness.
Are you going to start us off with your rendition of Elvis's "Are You Lonesome Tonight"?
As much as I'd love to, we're running short of time here.
We'll just consider it copyrighted. We're not able to do that.
That's right. It's for copyright infringement. Exactly. But we'd like to thank you for joining us today. As always, we want to thank Jim Farm, our clinical director here at Faithful and True. Jim is, as you can tell by just the information and knowledge and experience that he shares, that Jim is an LMFT. He's a CSAT. I've been encouraged to give some of your qualifications because people who are watching this go, why do they keep having that guy on?
Who's that bald guy?
And they go, which bald guy? Yes, exactly. We have our share of bald guys here. So anyway, we thank you as always for being with us today. It's always a joy to have you on the podcast. And Greg, what was the word I used for you? As usual, Greg was brilliant.
Usual suspect.
That's exactly right. So thank you for joining us. If you've been watching this, listening to us here, and we've opened your eyes to the need for you to reach out and get the help that you've been desiring, visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of resources and lots of information about the services that we provide here. Also, we invite you to take a look at the Men's Journey Workshop. This is an event that we do every month here at Faithful and True, and as well as the workshops for the spouses and for couples. And Greg, just a quick blurb about the new couples workshop, Journey Workshop 1, that we're now introducing.
Yeah, we were aware that when it comes to working with couples, there's really 2 seasons. And the first one is really about kind of normalizing, finding some balance, assessing a situation. And so we have created a workshop for couples who are early in recovery or are just now moving back towards each other in their coupleship or looking for support for that. we want to be able to provide that. So we now have the Couples Journey 1, and we also have the Couples Journey 2.
We'd like to thank you then for joining us. We hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.